sensory motor intelligence is the key to intelligent life in all forms. So when we grow up not stimulated by much movement, not stimulated by much tactile input, parked in environments that are more or less harsh, that sensory motor intelligence and the nervous system's global capacity to successfully control that one muscle, all kinds of things start to go haywire. And without touch, without movement, without exploratory movement and touch, without creative modes of movement and touch, that sensory motor intelligence becomes very stuck in narrow patterns. And that's a lot of what bodywork is about, is fostering that sensory motor feedback loop that is what makes us a successful organism.
Hello, and welcome to the Brilliant Body Podcast, where we explore the art, science, and philosophy of reclaiming somatic intelligence. I'm Mezey, host of the podcast, and a body-based practitioner for over 40 years. In this forum, my brilliant guests and I explore what it means to truly be rather than have a body. So join us and reclaim your body's brilliance. My next guest, Deane Juhan, may be best known as the author of Job's Body, a handbook for bodywork, which many consider the essential text on the means, methods, uses, and deeply personal applications of what has come to be known as bodywork, a vast, sophisticated series of modalities and techniques that take movement therapy and education to the level of personal transformation at its greatest expression, profound emotional release, and reintegration at its basic core. Deane is able to look back and recognize the influence of his mother, a beautician who also provided scalp massage to her loyal clientele. But he began his entry into adulthood as a young scholar, in particular a student of William Blake. It was his experiences at the Esalen Institute, in particular, meeting and studying with Dr. Milton Trager, which led Deane eventually into the 9-year research and writing project that emerged as Job's Body. So I first met Deane Juhan in the early to mid 1980s when I was living in Mill Valley as a young body worker, just starting out. And I had the great pleasure and honor of having one session with him, and it was amazing. I was all the more thrilled to hear that he was still practicing. In one of Gil Headley's Live with Gil conversations, I was transfixed by this conversation, and I immediately got on the horn and asked Deane if he would come and speak with me for you. So without further ado, the one and the only Deane Juhan. Hello, Deane. Thank you so much for agreeing to this
Oh, yeah.
invitation and having this conversation. It was so fantastic to hear you again after decades being with Gil. And I love that conversation, as did everybody. So I'm so excited to have you for my audience of the Brilliant Body podcast.
I appreciate the invitation.
So obviously you've had your hands on thousands of bodies over this 50 years.
I would calculate that.
Yeah, that's such an unusual perspective because, of course, there's very few people in society, including doctors and medical professionals and all kinds of people who don't even really touch the body nearly as thoroughly as you have, and I have for that matter.
No, in fact, most of those professions have restrictions on touching
Yeah.
patients and clients.
And even massage therapists now I hear aren't supposed to touch inner thighs or upper chests.
It's gotten absurd.
Yeah.
It's all in the name of preventing some untoward practitioner for doing some untoward thing, which the vast majority do not.
Yeah.
But those restrictions clamp down on everybody.
Yeah.
One of the things we could talk about is my sense of the deterioration of massage licensure do's and don'ts and
Mm.
the loss of old school holistic approach.
Mm,
And more, those old school massages, their founders age out
yeah.
and they sell to a corporation, and there went anything resembling a holistic quality of training.
Yeah. When I was in massage school, it was 1980 in Bob Brown's house, Soma School of Massage
Uh-huh.
in the Oakland Hills. And he was already in his 70s, this old hippie guy who trained thousands of people,
Right.
absolutely thorough and comprehensive. And it was the basis of my training and my career for decades.
Well, of course, when I worked at Esalen back in those days, I was nude, the client was nude,
Oh.
sunshine pouring down on both of us. There seems to be this kind of tacit assumption that if people take their clothes off, all hell is going to break loose. It doesn't happen.
It does change how people relate to each other, though, wouldn't you say?
Oh, very much so.
What was your experience of that in Esalen when suddenly nudity is such an integral part of society there, of human interchange?
Maybe let's start at the beginning. So in 1974, I was in my third year of my Ph.D. program at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley. And it was summer break. And I had one more year to go back to write my dissertation and do my orals, homing in on the finish line.
What was your dissertation about?
William Blake, a critical reading of the visions of the daughters of Albion,
Mm,
and which was largely about the body and sensual delight and its relationship to freedom and access to higher consciousness and whatnot. So there I was in my studio in the summertime in Berkeley with a new friend. And as the conversation went along, he asked me, "Have you ever been to Esalen?" And I said, "Where's that?" And he said, "Big Sur." I said, "Where's that?" He said, "Jump in the car." So we drove down to Carmel, waited for night to fall, and around midnight, we drove down to Esalen at that point, parked on the road up above the property. You couldn't get through the gate at that point.
mm.
So we snuck down over the hill, and he said, "Now everybody's going to have their clothes off. Just take your clothes off, hang them on these pegs, act normal, and follow me." So we walked down the last set of stairs to turn into the bath area, the hot baths. And I nestled down into one, and it was just an immediate, "Oh God, where has this been?" Out on the night sky that night, it was April 18th, 1974. That was my birthday,
Wow.
was the year of my Saturn return,
Mm,
which, if you follow all that, it's a full cycle of Saturn, which has to do with the structure of your life. And when the Saturn return comes around, all past bets are off. And typically, people go through large changes. And there was a full moon that night, 5 planets across the ecliptic. And I'm sitting there in the candlelight, and a guy comes up behind me and starts working on my shoulders. And I'd never had anybody touch me who had knowing hands,
mm.
any body work kind of capacity. Well, just a very few minutes, my brain was scattered all over the bathhouse floor. I did not know what had hit me, but I knew it was mightily significant.
Mm.
So I turned around and met this guy. His name was Ken LeBlanc. He's a wild Cajun. He was on the Esalen crew back then. And so we made friends through the night, chatted all night long. And several times that summer, I would drive back down to Esalen to visit Ken and gain access to the property and started meeting a lot of the Esalen folks and kind of being a day or a weekend at a time immersed in the grounds, the baths, the epic beauty that that little nook has down in the middle of Big Sur. And it came time for me to go back to Berkeley and start my last year towards my Ph.D. in English Lit. And I had my car keys in my hand. I was getting ready to unlock my car and drive away. And this guy came running up to me and said, please, please, I run the office and I've had my office interface with the public just quit the job. Are you interested?
Mm.
And I looked at him, I looked at the road, I looked at my car keys, and I put my car keys back in my pocket and said, what do you want me to do? And that was the beginning of 19-year residency at Esalen Institute.
So did you ever go back and finish your PhD?
I never did.
Really?
What that whole 9 years built from me, and as I got closer to the actual teaching profession and everything that it entailed on a PhD level, I really got more and more turned off. It just was not about what made me so devoted to literature. But what that did was prepare me to have the chops to research and write my book, Job's Body.
I definitely want to talk to you about this. The Vietnam War was going on at that time, why you had not been drafted.
Well, the drafting for the Vietnam War in my life took place considerably before that.
Okay, so it wasn't relevant to your life at that time.
I had managed to get a deferral by teaching a grade school in a little tiny mountain mining town.
Wow. Okay. I was
I
just
got,
curious.
nope, I didn't even have bone spurs, and I got out of that one. Referring to Trump's deferment was these bone spurs.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Oh my God.
Oh, where was I? There was
Yeah.
one of the members of the massage crew, a guy named Bill Lyle,
Mhm.
one weekend gave a workshop that was free to all those Esalen staff. And I said, yeah, why not? That's what got me here in the first place.
Mm.
Well, I took up this class, and it was the first day, and he was doing his demonstration. And when he sent us off in dyads to do what we think we saw him do,
Mm.
he came over behind me and stood there for a long time. It got very unnerving. And he leaned over close to my ear and said, I don't have anything to teach you. You're a natural. Get a job.
Did you grow up touching animals or being particularly tactile? Do you remember that as a child?
I think one of the things that really set my psyche up for an appreciation of touch was I had a childhood friend, very dear, close friend. And when we were 3, 4, 5, there was a game we used to play out on the lawn. Somebody would get a small little twig. One of us lay down on the grass. The guy who had the twig carefully, very delicately just traced contact with the skin, and it produced an exquisite sensation of pleasure. I mean, it was like on beyond a tickle.
Mm.
So the game was, as long as the receiver lied there perfectly still, they could keep receiving. The moment you twitched
Mm.
out of delight, you were it. And we would just trade that game back and forth for hours.
Mm.
It got to very high degrees of sensory pleasure that we were giving each other. So that, I think, set the stage in my mind that
Mm.
experience from long ago in my childhood got rather immediately brought back to the forefront when I first started receiving that sort of touch at Esalen Institute.
Mm.
So anyway, after that workshop, I spent 3 or 4 months working up a routine, worked on the manager of the massage crew, and he said, come to the next meeting. I want to vote you in. And I was voted in, and I became a massage practitioner on the Esalen Massage Crew. And that was the beginning of all of the fundamental changes in my life.
Mm.
Yeah. While I was there at Esalen doing my Esalen massage practice, Dr. Trager came to town, and I met him. I watched him work, and he gave a demonstration to the Esalen staff. It
Mm.
just absolutely blew my mind. I said, I do not know what this guy is doing, but I need to. And he came down another time and offered a workshop for the Esalen Massage Crew. I took that and I was permanently hooked. And that was one of the very first classes he taught.
Can you give us a brief description of what was distinct about Traeger work and about him?
Yeah, well, boy, he was a one off, Dr. Milton Trager. He was one of the most sprite like and almost like a Dalai Lama presence in his peace of mind and his projection. Very deep guy. So, physically, what characterized his work was a lot of very deft, light, jiggling, elongating, flowing open gestures with the body. The body was always in motion on the table. And that was a fundamental difference. He was using that motion to sense where resistance is, you know, and to begin developing in the client a heightened, more and more heightened sensory awareness that when every nook and cranny in the body is being fluidly moved and jiggled, that excites all your tactile nerve ends.
Mm-hmm.
And you don't feel your body much if you're not moving it. And so, in his jockeying around looking for resistances, he would constantly say, and this is the first practitioner I had ever heard say these words. He said, "It's all in the mind. The blockage is not in the tissue.
Mm.
The blockage is a neuromuscular patterning that has taken place over years of habituation until it becomes so normalized and the plasticity of our neuron system has so reinforced that particular tick of behavior or a restriction of behavior that we become entrapped with what William Blake called the mind forged manacles. And he just said we have to reach the unconscious area of the mind where that patterning is developed and learned and habituated.
Mm-hmm. How did he consider actual injury when the tissue is actually damaged?
Well, that
How
was
did
another
he do?
aspect of his work. With a normally healthy, more or less body, it could be very big and very
Mhm.
exploratory. Around an injury, his movements, you would reduce the size of the movements down to just, a quarter inch, half inch oscillation of the tissue that elicited pleasurable sensation without further damaging the injury and bringing the client's mind into the picture of healing by making it more and more aware, both on a conscious and unconscious level, of what needs to happen to this injury can tremendously increase the speed of recovery.
Yes, I call that bringing mind into matter.
Yeah, essentially, my position is that we don't have a relationship between mind and body. The mind and body are one thing. They're
Yes.
simply different aspects of our physiological well-being. So to change beliefs and concepts and feeling states in the mind is to change what signals are being sent to the muscles. And what the muscles are creating in terms of sensory stimulation, sending that information up to the brain, those two precincts of our unified being are brought more and more up into consciously felt experience. 90% of our sensory motor control happens on an unconscious level.
Mm.
Because if you had to figure it out, you wouldn't be able to get from where I'm sitting over to the door. I mean,
Yeah.
that involves billions of synaptic and biochemical activities that all have to be orchestrated in a very careful sequence. There's just no thinking your way through that. The mind controls the body's movements with feelings, with sensory awareness.
Mhm.
It's the sensory cortex on the top of the brain that records our movement memories. Those
Yeah.
values sink down into the brainstem, where neuroplasticity rewires everything down there to support a particular habit, which may be a skill and it may be a disaster.
Yeah.
But things take on a familiar feel no matter where we are. And the mind will revert to familiarity with an alarming tendency. Even if the familiar is terrible, it will go there because it's familiar.
Yeah.
So the sensory stimulation and the looking for where is the mind setting in a restriction? How do we noodle up against the edge of that restriction? Play with it tiny, if it has to be that way at first, building it up, getting more and more tissue involved, more and more extensive movements involved. All this is printing new sensory and new motor experience in the nervous system and in the body's sensory precincts. So you do that to be able to program a better way of carrying yourself and moving yourself than your old habits have allowed you to do. And he always used to say there's no erase button in the nervous system. What's happened has happened, and what's been habituated has been habituated. You need to build new experiences
Mm.
till they become strong enough to override those old patterns. And part of the work is table work, and part of the work is movement instructional work that Trager called his system of mentastics, mental gymnastics.
Mm.
And it's training the client after they get off the table to reproduce for themselves, as I'm doing, those feelings of delightful stimulation, exploring the edges of restrictions, and just getting into an active self exploration and self development that takes the development of these new patterns further and faster.
Mm-hmm.
That's pretty much what I view as the essence of his work.
What is your sense of how the tissues, actually what people call store memory, store emotion, store trauma, would you use that verb store, or what's your sense of the interplay between our life experiences and our actual physical tissue?
Well, that has a potentially complex answer, but
I'm sure.
let me say first that the primary storage of patterns and habits and traumas and past experiences, those are neural.
Mm.
There's not a muscle memory.
Mm.
Muscles are dumb. Muscles can only do what their motor nerve stimulates them to do. And that motor nerve is connected to spinal cord, brain. And another 90% of our nervous system is involved in directing and developing movement. So there's that, the storage of movement patterns. And one of my observations and my developing feeling of the sense of things over the years is that we really only have one muscle. No muscle ever acts in isolation, and no muscle ever acts alone. And what we have is very large areas of synergistic shortening and lengthening through a wide variety of muscle compartments. But functionally speaking, the brain does not map bicep, tricep, abdominals. The brain is mapping the whole thing all the time. And every muscle cell in your body is always doing one of four things. Some are shortening. For those to shorten, others have to lengthen. There has to be an underlying bracing going on so that the momentum that I'm creating don't jimmy joints and dislocate things. Everything except the desire movement has to be held back at bay. So I'm not just a massive jiggles every time I try to do something. So those values, shorten, lengthen, brace, remain neutral, are flickering back and forth at split-second speed in a kaleidoscopic fashion that is involved with any movement we are doing. And those muscles, depending on the stage of the movement, muscle rolls change very rapidly. So that's what we're getting into and dabbling into with the Trager approach. First of all, a pleasurable experience. So the mind's attention is drawn to the body and pay attention to sensations. We tend to try to not pay attention to sensations that don't feel good. So this is awakening focus and concentration through pleasure that invites the mind into that area of tissue. And I had said that this 90% of the nervous system involved, that involves prefrontal cortex memories, memories of traumas, associations of all kinds, triggered responses of all belief systems. What do I believe about my body?
You're pointing to your forehead when you were talking about that, as if all that is actually, its location is in the skull. Is that your view of that?
Well, the brain is the ultimate organizational structure of the nervous system. So, what this prefrontal cortex is associated with is
Mhm.
memory of all kinds.
Yeah, I was just curious because certainly after Gil's nerve tour, it was so impressed upon me how the brain is all through the body. It
Yeah.
is the whole nervous system, and that got me wondering even more how our tissues are infiltrated, not just with obviously blood and oxygen and nutrients, but could potentially be infiltrated with meaning, association, trauma, all these different aspects that we do tend to associate with the brain specifically.
That brings me back to my comment about how we have one muscle, and that
Yeah,
muscle is organized by one integrated nervous system.
yeah.
The nervous system doesn't have territories, it's all one thing. And it is absorbing sensory stimulation, it's processing information, it's launching a motor plan, it's tracking all the scores of things that are unconscious. An autonomic nervous system is keeping track of all the time. Oxygen levels, blood pressure, the physiological list goes on and on. And I blissfully don't have to pay attention to that very much as long as things are working. But when things break down, the mind is called upon to pay attention to what broke down and why.
Mhm.
And so that's the area that this work takes advantage of. How can we make it work better?
Have you had any particularly challenging recoveries in your life that your body broke down either structurally or organically in a way that brought you a whole different perspective in learning on your body that you had not gotten just as a practitioner and a professional?
Yeah, well, I'm just about 81.
Yeah.
So for
Amazing.
years, I've been going through this process of body aging and body
Yeah.
changing. I have kind of delicate kidneys, so I've got to really monitor that all the time. Turns out all I need is salt and fluid. That's very manageable. I've had a considerable amount of spinal deterioration. I've lost a lot of disc spaces in my neck and my thorax and my lumbars. What starts to happen over time is here's a vertebrae, here's a vertebrae. This upper vertebrae starts to grow little stalactites down into that bone space. And in particular, for many years, I've been dealing with a situation with my L5 and S1 joint, which has one of the retainer facets is gone. So that L5 twists and slides forward on my sacrum, and over the years has increasingly impinged that nerve trunk coming out of the L5 S1 nerve portal space. And, it can be demonic.
Yeah, I hear you. I can relate. I've had back trouble since I've been 3 years old with multiple injuries to my spine. What has helped me the most in the last 4 months is injections, these amazing injections, both ozone and also PRP. I can't recommend them highly enough for really easing the scar tissue and also the compression.
Well, I've had epidural cortisone injections.
Totally different thing.
They don't really do much at this.
No, this is totally regenerative and anti-inflammatory just from oxygen. It's really something. I highly recommend it. I want to ask you about how you perceive bodies as you're just walking around in the world. I'm so curious what that's like for you, just what you tend to look at when you're encountering another body, not just on your table, but just as a matter of course in your day to day.
Well, I'm a people watcher, Yeah. So many times I just feel the pain of
Mm,
watching somebody walk down the street with all these apparent pains and glitches and lousy postures. And these accumulations of these lousy postures and pains and glitches just drag the whole mental arena down. And this is what I have to be cautious of. It's very easy to just get all of your bandwidth swallowed up with those restrictions and pains.
Do you ever feel them in your own body when you look at any given body?
Do I feel their pain?
Yeah. Do you
Yeah.
feel their glitches and all that?
I can empathize with it because of my own injuries and history.
Yeah.
But one of the difficult truths of being a human being is that neither of us can genuinely feel what the other is feeling,
Mm.
can't think what the other is thinking. We are self-contained in our own biological, neurological universe. And this is what makes interaction and negotiation and sharing so critically important to the human experience because it takes a substantial amount of listening and effort towards empathy, which is not the same thing as actually feeling what the other person is feeling, for me to navigate what it's like to be this person. And that only comes through exchange of touch, exchange of words, ideas, listening to one another in a creative, open fashion. So, back to your question about on the street, what I generally observe is that there are very few people who are not laboring through dysfunctional habits and pains and poor postures. This need for touch and the role of touch in reorienting how a person is carrying themselves in gravity, which is our main job, until that is in some way attended to, which the bodywork profession is dedicated to,
Yes.
you're stuck. You're in your mind forged manacles. And boy, speaking of my Esalen beginnings too, one of the things that was really there for the get-go for me was as a massage therapist, I was immersed in the full smorgasbord of Esalen workshops and interactions. And there was emotional work, there was psychological work, there were work with beliefs, there were work developing interpersonal communicative skills. So to me, it was evident from the very beginning that cognitive belief, emotional tendencies, sensory motor patterns, and developing new patterns, that was all rolled into one ball.
Yeah.
Take emotions, for instance. Try a little mind experiment here with me. So I play my piano and I've worked years on this Chopin nocturne that is just one of the most gratifying soul experiences that I have for myself. And I've learned that nocturne sitting by myself at my piano, but slowly built a skill until every nuance, every transition, every harmony, every slight retard, every slight accelerate, it all becomes part of my motor skills, reproducing the profound sound quality and experience of that piece. And by the way, a lot of the enjoyment of that piece is just reveling in my own skill set and my own muscular sensations that have become so smooth and so functionally operative, highly developed skill. Well, on Thanksgiving, my mother hauls me down into the living room that is filled with guests, some of whom I don't even care for, sits me down at the piano to show everybody my nocturne.
Oh no.
What happens? It falls apart. You know,
Yeah.
I can't keep the tempo right. My fingers collide. All of the nuance is just out the window. Anxiety is overriding
Yes.
skill. Okay. So this is the thing that our emotions are doing to our sensory motor performance all the time.
Mhm.
And they're just our optimal states for smooth performance and mental states that really impair performance. And so that's another way to phrase what Dr. Trager's work is about, is bringing the mind into a mental state of peace, reduced anxiety, feelings of lightness, of competence, of self trust, of self love, all those things. And the pursuit between me and my client really is a meditative process.
Mhm.
I'm not working their tissue over. I'm using the quality of the sensations I'm creating. Milton Trager used to say, from my brain to my hands, from my hands to the client's tissue and their sensations to the client's brain. And that is the axis around which change takes.
Yeah. I remember you're using that word several times in your conversation with Gil, transmission. And I want to ask you about that, but I also wanted to refer to a book when you were talking about the piano, this amazing book written by the Blakesleys called The Body Has a Mind of Its Own. And they talk about how we map not just every aspect of our body and every relationship we have, but if you are a tennis player or you're a musician, that the body starts to perceive those tools or that instrument as actually part of the body and part of yourself. So the map becomes this circuit basically of your own neurology. And it's so interesting that then when it becomes a social situation and you start to also map the other people in the room, all of a sudden that intimate experience of just that one relationship starts to be, you could even say, corrupted or distracted by all these other more complex social relationships, which, as you're describing, trigger fear, anxiety, dislike,
Right.
resentment, all these things that then change those body maps, at least temporarily. It's interesting.
Well, consider the damage done to a growing child.
Yeah, of course.
Abuse, there can be violence, there can be emotional abuse, there can be lack of contact, there can be distant parents that aren't there for you or not attending for you. All those things in that dysfunctional marriage and extended family unit are marking that child with complexes and anxieties and strategies of survival that should not have had to have been struggled with, should have had the nurturing surround for the child's nervous system and emotional bases and cognitive function to emerge to its full potential. But boy, how many of us have had that experience?
Yeah. And also, even if we didn't grow up in a dangerous environment, just the lack of touch, a lack of safe touch that isn't at all sexual, that is just sensual and nurturing and reflective and kind. Most of us didn't get nearly as much touch as we need. So no wonder people have ADHD and are hyper and running around and
Yeah.
frustrated and lost and depressed and all these things.
The simple truth is, without adequate touch, your organism will degenerate and die. No infant can survive their first year of life without enough physical handling and contact. And that physical contact is also laden with meaning. Research has shown that when they observe a conversation and then start to tease apart what information was transferred back and forth, 20% of it has to do with the words. 80% of it has to do with projections through the body of where the person is coming from. And in terms of touch, us poor woebegone Western European descendants have been really, really short shrifted on touch. We came from Puritan stock,
Yep.
who left Europe to come here to do their thing, and touch was forbidden.
Yeah.
So we have grown up in a touch phobic, touch absence culture. Yeah, and this has impaired many of our physiological processes and,
Yeah.
and fuels much of our mutual understanding and potential joy together. This is not true everywhere in the world. The Anglo-Saxon descents have the least touch in their culture,
Mm-hmm.
any other culture on the face of the earth.
This
Brazil is off on the other extreme. If you don't want to be touched, do not get on a Brazilian bus.
It's true. I mean, even in the context of a lot of people's sexual lives, there's not a lot of touch.
No, there's not.
So unless you're smacking somebody on the ass when you're playing football,
Right.
or maybe you're getting, you know, there's a contact sport, or maybe if you're lucky, getting regular massages if you can afford it, it's definitely not enough of it.
Well, here's another psychological developmental problem with that lack of touch. The organism knows that it requires a certain amount of tactile input to
Mhm.
survive.
Yeah.
This is a fundamental life death issue. And these things, the nervous system is very cognizant of. So, for instance, if a young boy is hungering for tactile input, it is better to be in a gang and have rough and tumble violent contact than it
Yeah.
is to have no contact. Or imagine this is one of the driving forces between young girls and their attraction to less than functional romantic relationships.
Mm.
It's better for them to be shoved around than to be left alone. And this goes
Mm.
back to some fundamental neurological research that has been repeated many and many times with the
Yeah.
same results. They would take three populations of
Mm.
lab animals. They would abuse one population, they would pleasure another population, and they would leave the other population isolated. Both the abused and the pleasured organisms grow up to have functional nervous systems. The ones that are left out of anything rapidly deteriorate, develop neuroses, develop paranoias of all kinds. That a wonderful experiment that was, well, some people don't think it's so wonderful because of the animal experience involved, but it's
Yeah.
called Harlow's monkeys, in
Mm.
which one monkey in their cage has a wire mother that just has a bottle and a nipple and dispenses nourishment, physical food nourishment. The other one has a wire surrogate mother covered with soft material and warmed by a light bulb inside. And what Harlow demonstrated was that those monkeys would choose between the mothers. They would only contact the physical nourishing mother, the milk mother, for only as long as it took to drink enough milk to survive. And they spent all of the rest of the time with that
Mhm.
warm, fuzzy mom, regardless of the fact that she did not dispense what we think of as basic survival.
Ugh,
It's
so
just,
sad that so many of us have that experience of deprivation. I know I did.
I didn't grow up with much.
Do you think that, I mean, you described it a bit with your childhood friend. I think about this often, how I got some of my touch needs met by touching others for decades. Even if I'm not being touched, just having that contact of that flesh and my tactile experience of somebody else is definitely in part feeding that need. Would you talk about that for yourself?
Because one of the essential elements of the Traeger approach to treatment, so much of it has to do with a transmission of a feeling. I can't transfer a feeling I'm not having. Dr. Traeger used to say the most important part of the work is the practitioner's self-development, emotional IQ, intelligence IQ, sensory motor IQ. Draw me back to that sensory motor one in a minute. But it involves a merging of sensory experience that when I touch somebody, two touches are going on. I'm touching them and they're touching me.
Yes.
And so, in order to project this light, effortless, pleasurable feeling that irons out all the jangles that a nervous system can have, I have to be in that place. And I
Mm.
have to be experiencing that feedback loop between movement resistance, movement no resistance, every fraction of a now, if I'm to be successful in that transmission. I have to entrain myself to my clients' responses. And only then can I begin to change parameters of movement and lessen pain and all of that. So sometimes I wonder if the client's getting as much out of it as I am. Developing that space from which Dr. Trager's work has to come has been one of the transformative experiences of my life. It's my meditation. It's a very deep state.
Yes. Yeah, that gift of co-regulation that we can show up for other people in ways that help us show up for ourselves and vice versa. It's a really beautiful thing.
We're all transmitting to each other all the time.
Yeah.
You know, Milton Trager would just walk into a room and the people in the room would go, oh, and you know, we know who to steer away from on the street. They're putting out a vibe, you know.
Mhm.
Even if their only vibe is they're just completely shut down. You know? We're always projecting out into social space where our inner space is coming from. We can't help it.
Mhm.
And it's just how each of our nervous systems, perceptual systems, absorbs information that is material to my behavior to go towards the goodies and shy away from the gnarlies and take care of ourselves. You know? We all know people who sets everybody's teeth on edge the minute they walk in the room.
Mhm.
I want to loop back to a train of thought that got started with this sensory motor axis that we developed. Every living organism, single cells, multiple cells, complex creatures like ourselves, have three fundamental neural, even if there's no neurons, function. The organism is gathering information from the environment. It is paying attention to its internal environment. It is planning survival mechanisms based on that input. So for an earthworm, it's too dry, get out of there. It's too wet, I'm gonna drown, get out of there. For an amoeba, a toxin goes that way, shrink away. Oh, there's food, reach out a pseudopod. And these functions are fundamental to the
Mhm.
survival processes of any living cell. Right? So when nervous systems started to develop and neurons showed up, the neural system was just an increasingly elaborate and complex evolutionary changes that allowed for more and more discrimination, more and more repertoires of reactions, more and more development. But just like that earthworm, just like that amoeba, my central nervous system is doing exactly the same thing. Even I fall into that bollock step language.
Mm.
It's so pervasive. So, what am I doing? I'm taking in information through my special senses, through my touch receptors. Then my mind goes to work with that information. And what do I need to do in this situation? And it plans a motor response. It's not different with any living organism. We just have, we've made more complex means and ends. So, what am I trying to say as a core statement here? Sensory motor intelligence is the key to intelligent life in all forms. So, when we grow up not stimulated by much movement, not stimulated by much tactile input, parked in environments that are more or less harsh, that sensory motor intelligence and the nervous system's global capacity to successfully control that one muscle, all kinds of things start to go haywire.
So you use the term sensory motor IQ, which is such a provocative term. Anything else to add to that in terms of specifically referring to IQ?
Thing is sensory motor intelligence. In our analytical world, we're used to really only thinking about IQ, which
Yeah.
is the ability to manipulate symbols and follow logic, the rules of logic, essentially. We also have an emotional intelligence that is developed as we interface with people and have positive experiences and reinforcing experiences. What's happening to so many young people today is their lives are spent online. And online, there is no or a very minimal amount of emotional interface going on. It's all screens and
Yeah.
all zeros and ones, So they don't have developed social skills. They're not developing interactive touch. They're not developing emotional IQ. So sensory motor intelligence is another kind of intelligence. It's the successful functioning of those systems which allow me to build up a picture of the world, a picture of myself in that world, and successful motor responses to everything that's happening around me. And without touch, without movement, without exploratory movement and touch, without creative modes of movement and touch, that sensory motor intelligence becomes very stuck in narrow patterns. And that's a lot of what body work is about, is fostering that sensory motor feedback loop that is what makes us a successful organism.
Love it. Anything else you want to say about the interplay between that sensory motor intelligence and emotional intelligence? How they interact, how they develop each other?
Well, going back to our piano player, you know,
Yeah.
I mean, there's an example of an emotional disturbance, anxiety, completely throwing off track a very highly developed motor skill.
Yeah.
And this is happening all the time. This is why meditation can be such a critical factor. Meditation is just a sinking into sensing the body and through the body sensing the world. And by the way, I'm no fan of any of these spiritual paths or meditational practices that seeks to leap over the body up into bliss,
I totally agree with you.
spiritual bypass, and it's dangerous because those practices suppress our feelings of our body. And the initial experience and built experience of a meditative state is to become more and more aware of bodily processes and what's going on in every little nook and cranny of my tissues and how gravity is impacting my organism, paying attention to sensory awareness. It is through the sensory awareness that we can begin to clean up the bad habits our body has gotten into, build strategies that are better for ourselves. And it is through the healthy reorganization of the body that has to begin with sensory awareness and focus. That's the pathway up to higher consciousness and higher levels of learning states.
Love it.
Yeah.
And I think you probably just answered my two last questions, at least one of them, which is how do you define embodiment?
Embodiment is just being in sensory contact with your body. And that's what's absent for most people. They don't get enough diverse stimulation, and a lot of their sensory nerve ends just go to sleep, or they're sedentary so much of the time in chairs, in cars. They're not moving their tissues,
Yeah.
so they're not feeling their bodies. And we come from two traditions that have been very damaging to embodiment and being alive to our body sensations. One is the large heritage of our religious culture. So, in the religious culture we grew up in the Western world, the body, and particularly pleasure in the body, are mortal dangers to the soul. So, there starts a fierce repressive regimen. Pleasure connected with evil is what it nets down,
Yes.
you know, the devil's workshop and all that. This is haywire. Why would our maker give us this wonderful body and forbid us to pay attention to it? I've never gotten that one. The other is the advent of the scientific revolution and the scientific method, which has it that only objective, verifiable, weighable, measurable evidence counts for knowledge. And all these merely human vagaries of feeling states, emotions, in other words, all the things that are most important to us in our daily lives, none of that is admissible as data. Now, this is another totally haywire model with which to approach the world. So we're told our feelings don't matter. They don't count as anything that amounts to accurate data. And we're told that our feeling states are the devil's playground. This has created a Western civilization wide oppression of the body and the erasure of any considerable degree of embodiment for most of the people who've grown up under those two cultural values.
Totally agree. That's why I created the Brilliant Body podcast and have done everything I've done throughout my life.
The highest mortality rate situations don't have anything to do with germs or disease agents or trauma. They have to do with accumulative effects of repression. And if you're not paying attention to the body, it will wander off into very dysfunctional fields. So those are our main forms of killers are stress, lack of personal immersion and contact, these values that we only feed by feeling ourselves and being physically and emotionally and cognitively engaged with others.
Yes, totally agree with you. So what's going to save us, Deane, other than lots of body work for everyone? It's looking pretty grim right now for so many reasons, but particularly with AI coming in and obviously climate change and et cetera, et cetera.
Speaking of AI,
Yes.
this whole notion that the development of AI computer systems will eventually produce a sentient being that runs on chips. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of what an organic mind is. It's not chips, it's neuronal networks. Neural transmission is a fluid process, it's not an electron zip medium. You can teach a computer to say, I love you, but does that mean the computer loves you? I think not.
What this episode with Tanya Diamond was all about. She has a very, very different view, and it's mind boggling and disturbing and curious. You might want to listen to it and see if she changes your mind at all.
AI person.
I'll let you listen to it if you're interested, because
Well,
she's,
what AI can deliver and is delivering
yeah,
is vastly faster, vastly more complex database. It just soaks up data from everything online it can get. And from that database, analogs are created to extract certain realms of that database and regurgitate it. That is nothing like the nervous system works. You know,
that's what I thought too. But she's got some things to say about that. It's pretty
oh,
interesting.
well, though, these people are messianic in their view of AI.
Yeah.
AI will help us do a large number of wonderful things. It has huge application to correlating medical data and creating medical models to create new treatments. What it will never do is produce the forms of intelligence that a living organism has, because a living organism's intelligence is based on fluid systems, not chip systems.
Yeah.
And how are you going to give an AI system neuropeptides, which are the fundamental mood changing?
Well, what's really creepy, and she and I ended up talking about, is that they're creating hybrids so that AI can actually exist, not based on electricity, but on biological systems.
Interesting thing about every single person who has had an implant chip in their brains, they
Yeah.
died.
Did they? Well, I wouldn't want one. It makes me glad I'm old because I'm not going to be around in 30 or 40 years, probably.
Computer can give us more and more data and more combinations of that data. What it cannot give us is anything like a human companionship because they're
Woo!
fundamentally different systems.
I hear you, but you and I are body people to the bone, you know? Not everybody is nearly as body oriented. Hey, I've got one last question for
Okay.
you. I ask everybody this. What do you enjoy most about being your body or being a body?
Well, of course, there is the wide variety of skills that I and anybody else has developed that gives them pleasure. And I would have to say that the two of the most pleasurable places that I have in my embodiment is one, teaching a class, because I have to be in transmission contact with everybody in that class. I've got to read the room. I've got to read individuals. I've got to plan my learning strategy according to what shows up. And I'm called upon to use all of my vocal skills, all of my gestural skills, all of my table work skills to help others develop this skill. And the other is working one-on-one with people,
Hmm.
because that's when I'm so deeply immersed in the meditation of feeling through my antenna system the responses of my client as we go back and forth into this move, resist, move, no resist, change a plan when that's not working. So you have to stay constantly in the moment, and you have to constantly be ready to shift gears and do something else when something's not working. And being immersed in that merging of psychic bubbles and physical bubbles together is just one of the most exhilarating experiences of my life.
Hmm. No doubt for your clients as well, Deane, to have that privilege to be there. I hope to do that again myself and experience that after 40 something years since I've been on your table.
Where were you on my table?
Mill Valley, when it was in the early 80s.
Oh, wow. Oh,
It's been that long. So it's
oh,
been all this time. And then there you were at Gills. So I will come visit you before it's too late.
wonderful. And may I add to our listening audience contact information?
Yes. And anything else you want anybody to know, and where would you like them to find you?
Okay, well, my website is jobsbody.com, all small letters, no hyphen. Lots of information about myself on that. My email is my name, DeaneJuhan @gmail.com.
And you are still in practice.
I'm almost 81 and practice still growing.
Well, there you go. So do yourself a favor, audience, and make a beeline to the Bay Area and experience this being and these hands. Like I said, hope to get there myself in the not too distant future. And I just want to thank you so much for your generosity and for your mastery and for your wisdom and for your transmission.
Well, Allison, thank you very much for this experience to chat together and be with your people.
Thank you so much.
Go in peace, be light.
Thank you so much for tuning in and sticking around until the end. We hope that means you enjoyed today's episode. If so, we'd be incredibly grateful if you could share it with a friend, leave a review, and rate the podcast. It really helps us reach more people in our mission to expand the global understanding and experience of body brilliance. Our events and content remain free in our effort to expand the meaning of intelligence, but we do gratefully accept donations to help with our podcast's operating costs. You can find the link in our show notes. And while you're there, check out all the resources, gifts, definitions, photos, events, and tools we've included to help you dive deeper into today's topics. You can also visit www.thebrilliantbodypodcast.com for a complete list of episodes, body meditations, and many more brilliant things. And if you're curious to explore more ways I help bodies to reclaim their brilliance, visit my website at www.alimezey.com. And lastly, a huge hearty thank you to my co-producer and editor, the brilliant Florence Popoff, and to Blair, Mr. One-Man Band Wilson, for our theme music. Until next time, stay curious, stay connected, stay loving, and reclaim your brilliant body.